QSO Today, episode 462, John Bignell VE1JMB. The QSO Today podcast is listener-sponsored. Only you can keep the QSO Today podcast coming to you every weekend since 2014. Please become a listener sponsor, monthly or annually, by clicking on the sponsor banner on the top of the show notes page or at the top of the QSOtoday.com webpage. This is the best way to show your support and receive QSO Today Academy membership at the same time. Welcome to the QSO Today podcast. I'm Eric Guth, amateur call sign 4Z1UG, where I demonstrate the diversity and relevance of the amateur radio hobby and its impact on society by interviewing ham radio operators, many of whom played vital roles in shaping our technology through the amateur radio hobby. And while many people might say, ham radio? Do people still do that? This podcast demonstrates through in-depth interviews just how amazing, diverse, and dynamic the amateur radio hobby continues to be. After a one-year process, QSO Today is now a registered trademark with the U.S. Patent Office. This trademark protects the QSO Today brand from use outside of our QSO Today projects like the podcast, Expo, and now the QSO Today Academy. You will start to see the little R in the circle as we update our graphics. The QSO Today Academy event appears the weekend of September 9th and 10th, 2023. The Academy replaces our QSO Today Virtual Ham Expos that have run their course. The Academy, while having 2 live events per year, will also have all of the resources of a virtual ham radio school going forward. We already have some excellent presentations on the Academy website that will be featured at the Academy event. You can come to the QSO Today Academy by becoming a QSO Today listener sponsor, or by purchasing our $15 ticket for the event that is good for the Academy access for 30 days after the September event. Please click on the banners on this week's show notes page for more information and to purchase your ticket. John Bignell VE1JMB makes a difference by serving his Halifax, Nova Scotia community for many years as a paramedic and EMT. While involved with two-way radio as part of his profession for many years, amateur radio seemed like the most natural next step to John's radio life, but also reinforcing his community's emergency response when everything else fails during a disaster. VE1JMB is my QSO Today. VE1JMB, this is Eric 4Z1UG. Are you there, John?
Good day, Eric. This is Victor Echo 1 Julie Mike Bravo.
Good day, John. Thanks for joining me on the QSO Today podcast from Halifax, Nova Scotia, right?
Correct.
Let's start at the beginning of your ham radio story. When and how did it start for you?
I think for me, when I look at ham radio, I was a late adopter of ham radio, but radios were always a big part of my life. And I think back to when I first started and being interested in wireless communication and looking at what role that would play in my life. And it's kind of been a building block, a journey. And I think back to, as a kid, my parents owned a campground. So I grew up in a very busy environment where people coming and going. And in the 80s and into the 90s, it very much people were CB radio was a big part of people traveling. And there was one person in the campgrounds who was a ham, Dick Demon, an old Navy officer. And he was big into communications. He was really, he just took his license himself. He had a CB in the vehicle. But he spent a lot of time with me talking about wireless communication, showing me shortwave radio, introducing me to Morse code. But for me, just watching how the CB radio and the fact that I could talk on it and talk to people right around the world and in my neighborhood. And it just kind of, I thought it was like magic that depending on the bands would dictate how I could communicate and how far I could communicate. And that just really sparked my interest and passion around amateur radio. And Dick Demon, he was a really neat old guy. And I think as a father figure, as a mentor, as someone that just kind of took me under his wing, and that grandfatherly figure to show me what he was interested in. He was very much a person that loved the outdoors, loved scouting, loved being out and working with kids. And I remember we built a tin can, what they call them, a pit radio.
Tin can telephone?
Yeah, basically an AM radio with no batteries. And we built this in the backyard.
It was a crystal set then?
Yeah.
And you might have used a tin can to form the coil?
Yeah, but there was a name that they called it. The First World War soldiers used it to listen in. I'm trying to remember the name of it. Ditch radio or pit radio. Anyway, this is the radio he was trying to build, and him and I built this huge radio with copper wires and trying to listen to AM bands. And I remember thinking, how is this happening with no power, no batteries? Like it was amazing for me. So as a young person, that really sparked my interest around communication and wireless communication and the whole magic of the atmosphere and how it impacted communications. When I kind of grew up, went to school, at that time I was a lifeguard and I was in the fire department. And for me, I kind of stepped back from all communication. Now I was using it professionally. Now I had my 2-meter radio in the fire department, and it was very much just something as my daily routine, but I always enjoyed using the radios. But that was my transition into being a paramedic, because I wanted to be a firefighter originally, but it was just too competitive. Too many people were signing up. And at that time, being a paramedic was definitely the up and coming career. It was a job that people were saying, this is going to be a real profession someday, and you should jump on board now. And I was already on the rescue truck. I was working in the dispatch center at the fire department, and it just seemed like a nice fit. So that's kind of how I got into the interest of being a ham radio operator.
The hometown, was that also Halifax?
No, I grew up in a town called Middleton, Nova Scotia. It's known as the heart of the valley, and it's a small community in Nova Scotia that's kind of divided by two mountains and the Bay of Fundy, which has the highest tides in the world. And it was just a real small town upbringing.
Tell us a little bit about the area, about Nova Scotia. Is it a territory or province of Canada?
Yeah, Nova Scotia is one of the original locations of province of Nova Scotia. Is situated on the eastern coast of Canada. It's one of the founding sites of the colonies from Britain. It was originally, like, there's people, the Americans refer to the 13 colonies. Well, Nova Scotia and New Brunswick was very much the 14th colony, the colony they didn't capture, the colony they wanted to capture. It was kind of Washington's last regret that he wasn't able to take that from Britain before they settled on an agreement of being New England. And Nova Scotia has a long-standing history of a strong connection to the Britain, because a lot of the loyalists that left America settled in New Brunswick and PEI and Nova Scotia. But we really don't have icebergs. The ice doesn't really come down that far. We're closer to Maine and Boston than we are to Newfoundland and the kind of those northern climate areas. But Nova Scotia, it's warm, it's hot. It's the Annapolis Valley was very much a farming community, so it's a community where there's lots of farms, lots of working with your hands, like a woodlot type management, that type of thing.
The industry in Nova Scotia is fishing.
Historically, yeah.
Is there industry in terms of high tech or anything like that happening up there?
Yeah, a lot of basically the internet comes and leaves Nova Scotia through Europe. So our major pipe of the internet comes from a place called Purcell's Cove, and the internet lands in Nova Scotia and then travels throughout the rest of the country. And so it's one of the major hubs from an internet perspective. So we do have good high-speed internet here. It's kind of unique in the sense that I think Nova Scotia has kind of the best of all the worlds, in the sense we have some large cities with up to 1 million people, and then we have small communities where, I look at Middleton, it has 3,000 people. So it's a little mix of everything. And we still have lots of areas where it's remote, in the sense that you can walk into the woods and you'll see bears, deers, and no humans for miles, and then be downtown where you can have all the world cuisine at your fingertips.
The decision to become a paramedic or to become involved in public safety, were you a Boy Scout? Were you involved in public service as a child, as a teenager?
Yeah, I guess I kind of took it for granted, but there's definitely a linkage to that public service piece. That in my community we had the First Middleton Scout Group, and ironically, a lot of those youth that I worked with, or a lot of youth that I was part of the program with, became paramedics. And it's kind of interesting, that transition, that I never really spent much time thinking about it, but I was very active as a youth in the Duke of Edinburgh program, getting my gold award. In scouting in Canada, we have the Chief Scout Award and Queen's Venture Award, all awards that I was very successful in getting in my youth. It was just kind of the next process for me of that community service and giving back to the community. And I just really thoroughly enjoyed just being outside and being with my peers and getting out there and experiencing what I think scouting has to offer, making a well-rounded person.
In terms of the way that schooling works there, is it similar to the United States where you actually have high school through 12th grade and then you have a choice of where you go? Or is high school tracked? So there are people who are college bound or people who are bound on maybe a more hands-on track?
Yeah, we model very much the North American model of 12 grades, 12 years, and then by the time you're 17, 18, you've graduated with your high school diploma. I knew for me when I graduated from high school that there was no way I was going to pay now to go back to school. So for me, I very much stepped back. I was a member of the volunteer fire department. I was a lifeguard working, and I was like, why am I paying to go back to school? And I really was struggling with where do I want to put my energy and time. And I ended up joining a Canada World Youth. And it was a youth program where they partnered you with someone overseas, and then you traveled into another part of Canada and you worked on a farm, and then you went overseas and worked on another farm over there. So it was a billeted type program, much like the Peace Corps in America. And it very much kind of solidified my role of being a member of the community and giving back and kind of working as a team and being in stressful environments. When I lived overseas, it was in a small remote community of Thailand on the border of Cambodia, which was also being fought with the Khmer Rouge or the Khmer Dang, and they were being pushed back. So you'd see tracer bullets in the evening out my window as the Thais and the Cambodian forces were fighting this rebel group. So when I think back to that era, I knew I didn't want to go back to school, but I wasn't done learning and experiencing the world.
You served in the Canadian military?
I did not. I used the example as the Peace Corps, but it was more of an opportunity to, it was through the government, the program, but it was more of an informal education program for agriculture.
You kind of brought us to the point where you've become a paramedic instead of a fireman. As I recall, when I lived in Denver, Colorado, the fire department paramedics would arrive on a ladder truck or on a pumper.
Yeah.
Is that just in case?
At that time, yeah. At that time, it was kind of a weird situation. And I you go back to the early days of EMS and fire and the relationship, and you go back to Johnny Gage and a 1972 emergency TV show. We really didn't have a good, solid pre-hospital healthcare system. It was very much who's the best and most qualified to go. And in 1995, Nova Scotia kind of had this moment where they said, we need to improve our healthcare system. We need to improve our pre-hospital system, and actually modeled themselves after the Johnny Gage storyline. The medical director, Ron Stewart, was on the same committee as that TV show. He was now our health minister in government, and he believed that paramedics were their own identity, that he believed that healthcare should look after healthcare issues and no longer fire and emergency. It should be medical. So he wanted to line us more up with nurses, doctors, and from a medical perspective opposed to a rescue perspective. And that was kind of the eye-opening. At that time, I was on a rescue truck in the fire department, and people were saying, go pay attention to this EHS program. This is going to be really, really interesting. They'll train you. They'll support you. And I had an in already in my family. My family had, my uncles all had ambulances that they ran as private service. So I had an in to get into the system early, and then the government paid for the training, and then that hooked me up to be a paramedic, and then I went off to school to get my advanced care paramedic program. But it really was a transitional period of time where no one really knew what to expect. It was kind of scary because the safe bet was just to have the same model that's being used everywhere else. The fire, paramedic, if they need to be transported, call another agency to drive them. So it really was a unique period of time, and that model has worked. It stayed the test of time, and now we have kind of three divisions of police, fire, and ambulance, and they all work independently, but all work in unison.
Now, when did ham radio become part of your life?
I really kept talking about getting my license. I'm going to get my ham license, and just never did. And it really... probably about 2015, I started, I bought a CB radio, and I don't know if someone gave it to me or I ended up with a CB radio, and I built an antenna, and I was like, I want to go back to the days of the 80s when everyone was on the CB radio and there was no one there. And it kind of blew me away. And a buddy of mine saw a picture of me camping with my CB radio, my new antenna I built. And he's like, John, you gotta get your ham license. Like, CB's dead. No one's there. It's the dirty band. Don't waste your time. And that was his sentiment to me. And I kind of reflect on that moment as being that transition moment where I said, I really should get this done. I've talked about it. I really need to get my ham license. And then it was an injury. I had a patient, I was trying to get over the building and I twisted my back. I was in physiotherapy and I wasn't able to return back to work for a couple of weeks. And it was that moment that I said, you know what, I'm going to get my license. I got a book, started reading it. And then the local amateur radio club offered a course that September. And I signed up. I was like, I can fit this in. I can make it work with my schedule and just get it done.
You got your first license in what year?
That would have been 2015, 2014, 2015.
Canada has different levels of licenses?
Yeah.
What's the level that you took first?
The basic. So there's kind of three levels. You have your basic amateur radio license, and then you have your basic with honors, and then you have your advanced ham. So kind of three levels. The basic is your UHF, VHF frequencies. And then if you score high enough, then you get your honors, which you can use the HF frequencies. And then your advanced is more of you want to build repeaters, if you want to build power packs, and more just the advanced stuff.
You got the basic, and did you have the same call sign, the VE1JMB, when you got it?
Yeah, kind of a funny story. When I went to write the test, I'd worked a night shift. It was a busy night. I figured it wasn't going to be busy. Nothing's going to happen. I got a slow station, and we went nonstop, constantly all night, and there was no downtime. I wrote my test. I got off shift at 6:30 and wrote my test around 10. And as I'm writing, I was like, I don't remember anything. I'm so tired. I'm all done. And the ham that had basically did my test, and I didn't pass the first time. And I was like, how did I not pass? I've done all the tests online. I know this stuff. And he looked at me and goes, John, beta, alpha, beta. How do you make these mistakes? These are basic phonetics. And you got this wrong. You put delta down. I was like, and it was just me not paying attention, me not aware of what was going on. And it very much was, I was just exhausted and tired. So I didn't pass the first time I rode. And it was such a deflating moment. Like I've spent all this year in public safety. I've done so well at everything else, but I was just so tired. And I went back home and buckled down and said, no, I'm definitely going to pass. And I ended up passing with honors the next time I rode it. And I may try a good night's sleep. And it's the power of having a good night's sleep before you write any test. But it's kind of that cocky attitude. I got it. I know what I'm doing. I can handle it. But that ham still today reminds me of, do you know the phonetic alphabet, John? Do you know? I've used it my whole life, my whole career. And I made that mistake on the exam.
Now, what club did you do this ham radio test with?
The Halifax Amateur Radio Club. They put on basically 3 nights a week and then a full day on Saturday. It took about 2 months.
That's pretty intensive, 3 nights a week, right?
Yeah. It was pretty, it was great though. Covered lots of material. They had speakers in. It was a really, really great program.
What did your class look like in terms of a demographic?
Well, Halifax is very much a seaport. We have a lot of Navy. We have a lot of Army. It's very much a military town. And it was all engineers and soldiers, basically, and Navy officers.
Any kids?
There were no kids in that class. No, none. But ironically, when I did pass my test, I wrote it with a 15-year-old. So we're at the ham's house, and he's laying on the table, and we wrote our test, and I'm done. I'm starting to question, like, am I done? Should I read it over again? Should I make changes? I'm done. And I went down, he checked it. He checked the other kid at 15. He congratulated the 15-year-old. Good job. That's fantastic. He looked at me and goes, John, what's up? What did you do here? And I was like, no, come on. Because I'm just joking with you. You passed. You got it. So there are kids involved, but they always like to poke me.
And obviously I'm putting you in a miserable position of making some comment about the radio club that you're very active in. But what did the Halifax Amateur Radio Club do well or right with the hams that passed the test in terms of follow-up and making sure that they got on the air?
Not to criticize my club, but I think we can always do better. And I think there's an element of there was a major transitioning happening in the club at that time. So we were moving from one location to another location. So towers being torn down. There was a lot of angst about why are we moving to this new club location. EMO wanted us in a fire station and not in a rec department building. So a lot of people didn't like how far it was outside the city. Others thought it was great. So there was a lot of upheaval and a lot of politics that I wasn't even aware of at the time. And it really kind of divided the club up dramatically. So when I think back at that era and at that time, it very much was a bad time for the Halifax Amateur Radio Club, which has a long, long history going back to the 1930s. We have minutes from the 1932 formation of the Halifax Amateur Radio Club, and it's been consistently a ham club since then. So what could we do? I think there's always room for embracing and mentorship. Thankfully, there was a couple hams that really took me under the wing. Dick VE1AI really kind of mentored me and harassed me nonstop about my ability to pass and fail tests, and reminds me all the time to get a good night's sleep. But for me, it very much, I think any club should set up a system where if you're a new ham, then you partner with someone. And that person kind of mentors and makes sure they watch you, gets you equipment that you need, makes that link. Because it's really, really tough. When you walk into a room as a paramedic and everyone's an engineer talking very, very technical, then it's really, really impeding and really, really tough to kind of break into the conversation when they're talking about electrodes and technical stuff. And I'm sitting there going, I know how to talk. I've dealt with emergencies, but I don't have that ability to talk about a half wavelength on a dipole. It can be really, really intimidating.
Well, I think that's been kind of a constant theme of the QSO Today podcast. As a matter of fact, we're talking today. I received my first amateur radio license 50 years ago today.
Congratulations.
I'm an old timer now, apparently. I can never stress the importance of the Elmers that I had, in those days. These old guys that were willing to extend a teenager a hand. And I think that we forget that there's a lot of things that we do because of the years of doing it, like putting a PL259 on the end of a piece of RG8 coax, for example, that we take for granted that it's so easy, but someone who's never done it before, it's quite a task. And having that person give you those hours of time, and I can tell you, as a teenager, people gave me hours of time, can't be replaced. I agree with you 100%. I think every ham club, if they can do it, should pair up old-timers with newbies in order to be able to pass on that success.
We take it for granted, the knowledge. We really, really do. We throw acronyms and terms around like the no business. And I even in our radio club room, I said, we should just have a script here that says, this is your name, this is what you do, this is how you do it, so people can just read it without actually thinking about it. And as a new ham, that was critical. And I remember I was welcomed into, it's probably the first month and a half of being a new ham. We were traveling to New York to go to Broadway shows, and I reached out to the local ham club and said, hey, I'm going to be in the area. I'd love to see your radio room. Can I come down and, are you having any meetups? Are you having any club events? What are you doing? And the university had a really nice radio room, and they said, yeah, we're going to be meeting on Saturday at 10 o'clock. Love to have you come out. And I think if there's anything that is unique about ham radio is they didn't know who I was, but because I was a ham, they invited me. And because we had that connection, it didn't matter anything else. We were still part of that fraternity, that family. And I spent the morning there listening to the radios and learning about their system and their environment. And it really opened my eyes that we're one big family, and people want to share, people want to embrace. And as a new ham, it was kind of cool to be able to make that connection with locals and really transcend the boundaries that I normally wouldn't have an opportunity to connect with these people.
Well, I think I've said it also on the show that I like to knock on doors of houses that have ham antennas and ask if there's a ham radio operator inside. I still do that. I have some very good friends that I've made over the years because I've done that. I think that's what you should do. I don't know how people are in terms of whether a stranger knocks on their door and asks if there's a ham radio operator here, but it's a great way to meet new people. And as part of the fraternity, you're part of the big family. I think it's probably better than, say, being a Jewel Tea salesman or a Fuller Brush salesman. The ham radio gives you more entree.
Totally. Yeah. And yes, I agree. And I think it's opening. Who doesn't want to show off their radio room? Who doesn't want to talk about their antenna? If someone knocked on my door, I'd be welcoming them. Come on in and have a seat. I'll show you what we got going on here.
So what was the first amateur radio that you bought?
Of course, a Bofang. Everyone got a Bofang, right?
Yeah.
Because at that point in time, I didn't know, was this something I was going to really be passionate about? Was this something that I was going to really put a lot of energy in? I was like, $25? Yeah, I'll order 5 or 6 of them, and everyone in the family can have one. I can set them with this family service radio. And so, yeah, that was my very, very first radio. And then when I realized this is something I really want to spend more time in, this is something that I think is unique and a hobby I'm going to invest in. I bought a used Yaesu 757 GX2. Nice rig, hooked up to a dipole. It was in the corner of my dining room on a TV tray with a MFJ antenna tuner going to a big dipole out my back window. And that kind of opened up the world to me. I was like, this is really, really interesting. And it was I think it was Dick VE1AI that said it to me. He goes, once upon a time in ham radio, you could try everything. And you reach a certain point where you've done all the bands, you've done all the activations, you've kind of maxed out. They said, we're now entering an era where we have microprocessors, where we have digital communication. We have a new era where you can specialize in one area and never touch a whole other area of amateur radio. And it's so vast now. It's so big. It's more than just the point-to-point contact. And amateur radio, from moon bounce to digital communications with Whisper and all the software-defined radios, it really is amazing that you potentially could not try everything in amateur radio. And we're kind of at that stage now.
I think ham radio is bigger now than it's ever been in its lifetime.
Yeah, I agree.
So, yeah, I think you're right. It pays to laser beam focus, I think, and master one skill before moving on to another. Otherwise, you feel like you're in the store and you don't know which thing to pull off the shelf. And now this mid-show break. The future of podcasting and the QSO Today podcast is listener sponsorship. It keeps us lean and focused on providing you the best ham radio interviews since 2014. I appreciate that the following people responded to my plea for sponsors and donations to keep the QSO Today project alive and healthy. There is a new section on the QSO Today podcast show notes page where I list the most recent sponsors and donors over the last 30 days. This list is generated automatically from my membership system. This week's new listener sponsors are Travis Lisk, NYLI, $100 annual sponsor. John Kitchens, NS6X, $100 annual sponsor. Lee Barrett, K7NM, $10 monthly sponsor. Phil Erickson, W1PJE, $10 monthly sponsor. David Oakrent, W7DAO, $100 annual sponsor. And Michelle Thompson, W5NYV, $100 annual sponsor. This week's new donors are Tom Langer, KD9FPC, $20. There were a number of anonymous donors as well, and we appreciate their contributions without mentioning them by name. You can keep the QSO Today podcast commercial and sponsor-free by becoming a listener sponsor yourself. For $10 a month, or save 20% at $100 per year, you can become a listener sponsor. I am now recording the QSO Today podcast as video interviews that are available only as a benefit to listener sponsors through our QSO Today community website. As I develop the sponsorship tier, I will add bonus content for listener sponsors. Listener sponsors, not donors, are automatically members of the new QSO Today Academy. That includes the upcoming QSO Today Academy event on September 9th and 10th, 2023. I am building the Academy website to include access to our Sequel.io networking lounges all of the time, even after the event, and Academy resources including over 400 previous Expo presentations with Q&A, and additional helpful ham radio educational resources. The benefit of listener sponsorship as an alternative to commercial sponsorship is that commercial sponsors influence the content and comments in the podcast. Listener sponsorship allows a greater degree of freedom to discuss any ham radio subject without commercial consequence. I have eliminated all commercials in the QSO Today podcast from episode 445, with the exception of the Ham Radio Workbench podcast, as I think that this is a serious asset to a well-rounded ham radio education. I am not using Buy Me a Coffee or Patreon, but my own system for managing the community that could form out of the podcast. I direct you to the sponsorship section of the show notes pages beginning with the episode 444, where I list all of the contributors to the podcast since 2014, including sponsors, donors, and hams who have paid for transcriptions. Our funding model is now value for value, where you trade with me your time, talent, or treasure that you think values the benefit of the QSO Today podcast to you. If sponsorship is not your interest, then you can make any size donation to the podcast by clicking on the donation button on the QSO Today podcast website at qsotoday.com. There is a slider that you can use to adjust the amount of your donation. If you want to make your donation monthly, click on the recurring donation box. It is the recurring donations and the listener sponsorships that keep the lights burning here. Finally, you don't have to contribute anything to listen to the QSO Today podcast. You can use my Amazon affiliate link before shopping at Amazon by clicking on it on the right side of the show notes page. This will signal Amazon to send us a small percentage of what you purchase. This is the most painless way to ensure that the QSO Today project will be here next week. I want to thank everyone who has contributed and will contribute to my effort to create this oral history of amateur radio since 2014. It will eventually all be in the public domain for hams in the future to enjoy. Be sure to become a listener sponsor or make a donation today. And now we return to our QSO Today. One of the reasons that we're having this conversation, and I'm so delighted that we are having it, is that you sent me a message and said, we're coming up on the 25th anniversary of the Swissair 111 crash off of Nova Scotia. I'm interested in knowing what the impact was on the airliner crash in the Halifax area and what role the community played in rescue attempts and what the amateur radio community and how they played in it. Could we talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, for sure. So Swissair 111 was a McDonnell Douglas MD-11, and it was known as the UN shuttle. So people flying out of New York, going to Geneva, it was a busy corridor, and that flight was the flight that all the UN personnel used. And in September 2nd, 1998, it was flying over the Atlantic coast, and they sent out a distress pan, pan, pan. They had smoke in the cockpit, and then they circled into Halifax because they were originally trying to hit Boston, but circled into Halifax, and then realized they were too high, too heavy. So they dumped the fuel, circled around St. Margaret's Bay, came up through Peggy's Cove, and then dropped off the radar. 10:40, that was 10:30, and it was, we talk about significance. For that community, being a small community, there were 8 kilometers offshore where the crash site was and 25 kilometers from Halifax. It was a defining moment for the community of St. Margaret's Bay by any means. And for the Halifax Amateur Radio Club, it was a moment where they were actually activated for emergency communications.
How did it play out? The aircraft obviously missed the runway. It was in a field somewhere?
No, what happened is the owner in the cockpit ended up being linked up to the new entertainment system that had been installed. At that time, planes didn't really have video systems. They didn't have access to the internet. This plane did. So you had 229 people on board that had the most advanced flight entertainment system where they could pick movies, they could access web pages, get live data, and that, they believe, is what caused the fire. And when they started going through their checklist, they turned off fans and turned off systems, and as a result, that just fueled the fire, and then it completely erupted in flames. They lost autopilot, and then they crashed in the St. Margaret's Bay and basically straight down into the water. Yeah.
Were there survivors?
No survivors, no. And that there was word about 1:30 in the morning. There was word that there was survivors, and that ended up being false. No one survived. And there really wasn't much left. In my role, when I think back to that moment, I was in Halifax at my girlfriend's house, who ended up being my wife, and I get a phone call from my family in the community saying something bad just happened. You need to come home and help out. I drove from Halifax into Hubbard, got my uniform on, went to the paramedic station to see what was happening. And everyone's heading down to Bayswater. Everyone's heading down the coast. You should head down that way. So I jumped in my vehicle and drove down. I was off duty. I wasn't working, but I went down to see if there's anything I could do to help out. I got down there and they were putting crews together. So the fire department, the police, some volunteers were all being put on to fishing boats. And as part of the Coast Guard Auxiliary, they were forming up these search groups and asking fishermen to head out and search for survivors. So myself, two firefighters, another paramedic, and then the captain and his crew, and a physician, the local physician. We all jumped on the boat, and it kind of the last conversation on that boat was an information session from Irving Oil talking about how jet fuel would affect people and how to wash them off. Very much we were leaving the dockside to go do a rescue, and very much in the mindset of we need to go out there and save people. The challenge was no one had the ability to communicate. Everyone was on different frequency, everyone was on different bands. And so the coordination piece was the missing link of this disaster.
So the lesson from this disaster was that there needed to be better coordination. How did that end up playing out? Was there efforts made then to create a better system?
Yeah, and very much the play out from there. We were motoring out, and I remember the captain looked at me and he goes, "Where are we going?" And I was like, "I thought you knew where to go." And I was like, "No, I have no idea where we're going." And they had flares set up in the bay, and we were leaving Northwest Cove. And so we'll head towards the flares. Let's see what's over there. But we couldn't talk to anyone at the command center because we were on the marine radio. The Auroras were flying overhead. They couldn't talk to us. So there was all these missing pieces. We all had radios. We all had the ability to communicate. We all, for the most part, were on 2 meters, but no one was able to really connect. And Barry Manuel, the emergency manager at the time, VE1JMB, was also a ham. And he was the person in charge of all disasters for Nova Scotia, based out of Halifax. He called Dave George, who was the coordinator for the Halifax Amateur Radio Club. Dave is VE1AJP, and he's the one that initiated the HARC and said, "We have a problem. We can't talk to all the people that are responding to this," because it was a multi-agency. You had the Navy, you had the Auxiliary Coast Guard, you had the Coast Guard, you had EHS, the ambulance system, you had the police, you had fire, all with radios, but no one had mutual aid. There was no coordinated conversation piece. So a crew of hams from HARC all went down to Piggy's Cove. Initially it went to Bayswater, which is kind of the other side of the cove. So the bays on either side, to get Bayswater and Piggy's Cove, and then that's the mouth of the harbor. And they initially deployed to those locations, and it was about 8 kilometers off those 2 points. And just try to, at that point, there really wasn't a game plan other than to try to establish communication, or multi-tier communication. So one of the big concerns was connecting to the military. So getting off of our frequency and getting into the, I think it was 5717 kilohertz, an upper sideband, and then able to talk to the aircraft that were flying overhead. The RCMP at Piggy's Cove could then communicate with the Auroras and then communicate with the Marine, and it just was that missing link. And over 110 HARC members and auxiliary people throughout Nova Scotia all came in for the next 5 days to support communication operations at the site as it moved from a rescue operation to a recovery operation. And it really solidified the role that hams played and the importance of wireless communication, but more importantly, we all need to be on the same frequency. We all need to be on the same channel, and a system really needed to improve and expand because we didn't have the ability to talk to each other other than within our own little silos. So you had a person like Joe McPherson, who was on our HARC board. He's a VE1CH, and he was part of the Red Cross. So they had their own radio room, their own system, and it really was the big challenge to try to communicate all of us and coordinate effort. So a whole lot of lessons learned came from that, from Swissair.
And how were those lessons deployed then afterwards? Do you now have the ability to either patch channels together or go onto the same channels? How does it work now?
I think in Nova Scotia, and you look at going into the 90s, 2000s, very much ham radio solidified itself as a provider of emergency communication. The advent of WinLink became the tool that we're embracing. But from a provincial perspective, they then looked at TMR2, the Trunk Mobile Radio Network, and they formed a whole division based on ham radio operators saying, we want one team, one department that looks after wireless communication and have redundancy. So the ability to have UHF, VHF, TMR, and then kind of build on it from there. And TMR has, at that time, 2001, when they set it up, had 69 towers, which were connected to the Bell Mobility Network. And then by 2015, it had grown to 89 towers with the TMR2 system being implemented. And they're actually looking at operating it again. So right now in Nova Scotia, we have a system that allows any TMR radio to connect with any other radio in the province through a talk group type network. So if I want to, in my ambulance, talk to a firefighter or to a police officer or to anyone connected other than via air, I could via the TMR2 radio network. And it really kind of came from that Swissair event where they looked at, we can't talk to each other and we really need to be able to have better communications.
Does that TMR2 system also have patches or a way to, say, interconnect to emergency channels on marine VHF?
Yeah, totally. And that's usually patched through our dispatch center. So we have Shuby Radio, which is the central hub, and then they have the satellite connections from there. But Shuby Radio is the coordination center for all communications. And then from there it goes into the dispatch center of medical first response or into fire response. But yeah, the ability to, the biggest challenge that we've learned as a result of TMR being so effective is how ineffective it can be when it actually goes down. And we look back on 2017 when they cut the cables from Bell going into the Maritimes, we lost all TMR radio and everyone couldn't talk to anyone. So having UHF, VHF as a backup plan was probably the biggest piece that have come from these events. And even more recently, when we had the Fiona hurricane that came through, where the trunk radio system went down for 3 or 4 hours, we had a cardiac arrest in one area, and it failed. It did not work for that area. I think looking at any system and saying it is the end all to be all is really, really dangerous. Trunk radio is an amazing piece of technology, but when you look at the error, the 1% chance it does fail, usually significant and high risk errors do happen at that time.
What is the role then for the Halifax Amateur Radio Club? Do they still provide communications on their VHF, UHF infrastructure that could be, they might have repeaters or simplex channels that are complementary to the TMR2 system?
Yeah, totally. And it's the backup to the backup, right? When you look at our network in Nova Scotia, the Mavcom system is very much that analog connectivity where we can connect any repeater throughout the whole province. And it's still being used by the fire departments through their network. And it's still, from my perspective, it's a backup to the backup. TMR is good, but when TMR goes down, you need something else. And that's where the Halifax Amateur Radio Club can come in and play an active role. And it's one of those things that I think we've, as an organization or as a society, we've put a lot of weight into our cell phones. We put a lot of weight into the network will just stay up. And we've learned from Sandy, the hurricane came through the States, and other, Katrina, cell phones are the least effective tool, and they're connected to the TMR. The TMR is essentially an adjunct of the cellular network.
In an emergency, the amateur radio EMS could be activated just anyway, just as that fallback position, so that you're not calling them hours later and saying, hey, nothing's working, we need you now.
Yeah. And I think we've entered a stage where it's worked it's worked so well that amateur radio is kind of put on the back burner saying we don't really need it. And I think that as an emergency manager now, my current career, I think that's a real misstep. And I think we really need to evaluate the ability to set up independently and not be connected to a network, not connected to a third-party business. We need to be agnostic to all those issues.
Well, it's interesting. Here in Israel, I'll probably get some blowback from this, but amateur radio operators are not used at all for any emergency communications because we think that all of the emergency services, and our emergency services are very good, but we also rely on heavy infrastructure, trunk radio systems, a lot of microwave, a lot of fiber. And so therefore, the public service side here, in terms of amateur radio, is not, I don't know anybody that's involved in it. And then the other issue we seem to have is that if we were deployed, who's responsible for us if we get hurt? So then there's insurance issues in terms of which agency is going to cover the casualties, whether they're minor or major, for volunteers who are trying to do the job and get hurt in the process of doing the job. So unfortunately for us, we have no amateur radio emergency service here, which in a way is too bad because I think we still have the expertise that we could apply when it comes to actually knowing how radios work and being able to throw something together when the entire house of cards falls down.
Yes, I agree 100%. And I think we put too much reliance on the system. And we know throughout history, the system doesn't always work well. The Titanic was never supposed to sink, but it did. And throughout history, we put so much reliance on this isn't going to be a problem. And it's those high risk, low frequency type scenarios that will always get us in the butt.
I want to take a minute to tell you about my favorite podcast, the Ham Radio Workbench Podcast, with George, KJ6VU, and now joined by Rod, VA30N, Mike, VA3MW, Mark, N6MTS, and Vince, VE6LK. Every 2 weeks, George and company offer up a status report on the many amateur radio projects on their workbenches and explore projects on their guests' workbenches. This group is project active and prolific, covering many technical areas of amateur radio. So the next time you want a deep dive into ham radio electronic project building, or to learn about technology, tools, test equipment, construction techniques, and the rest, listen to the Ham Radio Workbench podcast, available on every podcast player and channel. Use the link in this week's show notes page to get to the Ham Radio Workbench podcast directly. And now back to my QSO. Now you're wearing a Salvation Army logo shirt. That's what I'm seeing. You've got some patches on your shoulder. That's kind of cool. I might be naive, but I didn't know the Salvation Army played a disaster role. I dress from the Salvation Army stores. That's why I'm the fashion icon that I am. But tell me what you're doing with the Salvation Army and what the Salvation Army is doing in Nova Scotia.
As I said, I worked for EHS as an advanced care paramedic. I worked in the communication department, working with medical dispatch, and it kind of hit a point where after 28 years, I realized that I'd done everything I was going to do as a paramedic, and I stepped back saying, what's next? I feel there's a few more years left of good, solid work. I felt that I've waited too much longer. I'd kind of age out and not want to do it anymore. And I also felt that if I stayed, that physically I would not be able to continue hauling people out of the ditch and doing the physical job of a 20-year-old as almost a 50-year-old. So for me, it was that moment of saying, well, what's next? And I took the big leap of faith and went back to school, became an emergency manager, took the training, and left paramedicine altogether and went into the Salvation Army. And the Salvation Army is a really amazing organization when it comes to emergency management. I think they fly low on the radar and provide a lot of community support. In Canada alone, they're the number one, the second to the government for support when it comes to social programs and social services. And in Nova Scotia, I'm in charge of looking after all the emergency response of all the volunteers, the food trucks, and the coordinated effort of the Salvation Army to provide support for disaster. And ironically, when I joined on in September, and that was a Monday, I signed up, I'm doing my orientation, and then within 14 days of joining, we had a major hurricane come through Nova Scotia. So it was really a rude awakening for me to go from being a student to being full-time emergency manager and in the middle of a hurricane on day 14 of my new position.
So what that means then is, for example, if you have people evacuating their homes and they're going to like a high school because it's a shelter, the Salvation Army then supplies food and beds and blankets and everything that's necessary in order for those people to wait out the storm.
Our niche, we have a really great relationship with the Red Cross. Red Cross provides the actual bedding and the location of the shelter. We come in for food and hydration and emotional spiritual care. So the piece that we focus on is that making sure people are mentally in a good place and provide that mental health component, and then make sure they're full and have a good solid meal. And that's really where our focus when it comes to a disaster. And for Fiona, when Hurricane Fiona came through Nova Scotia, we had power in Cape Breton. It was a huge impact on an area of Cape Breton that was without power, struggling financially anyway. Some of the communities were quite remote and not I hate to call them poor, but there are areas that were really struggling financially. A lot of the communities were mining communities that the mines had shut down, and they just really hadn't rebuilt themselves. So we moved in with our food trucks, the canteen trucks, and provided food support for the community. And we were serving 1,700 meals to about a population of just under 200,000 people. So it really was a huge operation for about 35 days. And even from that perspective, there was no ability to communicate. Cell phones were staggered. We had a hard time getting our food in and our supplies in, and it relied on ham radio. Ham radio became our go-to in that scenario because cell phones just weren't reliable, and we had no power at the church. So we had generator power. So the ability to have WinLink set up, connected to our system, either HF or the 2-meter network, and then getting our emails from our food truck to our supplier and then back to us was all done via WinLink, which became a really, really powerful tool. And since I joined the Salvation Army, every disaster since then, in the last 9 months, I've made sure amateur radio played a role in it as a backup, someone off the side ready to respond, ready to be deployed, and someone just monitoring the bands.
Do you have amateur radio volunteers at the Salvation Army, or do you go to a local EMS emergency, ARES, or something like that group for your amateurs when you need them?
Ironically, there was 3 hams that were already volunteers. And then since then, there's been people who say, I want to take the course to be hams. And they've taken the program and challenged the test. So we now have a small core group of people that are amateur radio operators spread out throughout the Maritimes. We do have a good relationship with the national body, Radio Amateurs of Canada. So we do have an MOU as an organization with them to provide support. So if the need ever did arise, I could reach out to those people. But right now we're, for the most part, keeping it in-house so that our volunteers are lined up with what we're doing and what we're part of. As soon as it gets big enough and you start reaching out to volunteers that don't have a criminal record check, don't have their certification, then you open up that can of worms of liability. We do have that mechanism to have that spontaneous volunteer aspect set up, but right now our focus is, can we get volunteers that are interested in amateur radio on our team and then find a role for them? And for me, it's been a critical piece to our whole disaster plan.
And do you provide some kind of training that's specific to your amateur radio operators who work with the Salvation Army?
Yeah, there's a great program that was started up in America called Saturn, and it used to be in Canada, and then it was kind of put on the back burner because cell phones were working, we don't really need it, and all the reasons why amateur radio is dead. It kind of got shelved. And then when I joined on to Salvation Army, I found that dusty old shelf and pulled off that binder saying, what about the Saturn program? Can we talk a little bit about this? This seems like a really great tool that we should be embracing. And there's a lot of hums and haws. Do we really need it? Do we don't need it? And I was like, I think I can use them. I think we should be using it. And from an organizational perspective, it's volunteer engagement. So we want to have our volunteers interested, engaged, and we want our volunteers to feel connected. And disasters don't happen every day. Disasters don't happen every year. Ironically, this year they've happened 3 times in Nova Scotia, but they normally don't. So finding something for people to do and something that they're interested in, amateur radio then becomes a hobby. And it allows us to exercise, allows us to implement programs and just kind of do fun things. And one of the training exercises we did was we kind of reenacted a mining disaster. In 1936 in Gold River, there was a huge mining disaster. It ended up being this huge international event. One of the local radio stations set up basically a radio link to the radio station and then broadcasted live around the world. Frank and became international sensation because it was kind of the first live 24-hour broadcast live from the mine. And then people throughout the world were listening to their shortwave radio as events were happening, as they tried to rescue these miners, these 3 miners that were in the Gold River. And for us, it was kind of a cool milestone. Halifax Amateur Radio Club was involved, Salvation Army was involved, and we got a whole bunch of hams together, and we all went to the site where they have a museum now, set up our radios, and tried connecting and tried activating it through a POTA activation. And it was really just a fun day where we had a food truck, so everyone got to eat. We had amateur radio operators out there. We had our WinLink. We had our POTA teams. And it was just a very informal way to kind of reenact a historical moment in amateur radio.
I'm curious, you have 2 boys. On your website, you have a picture of your family, a very nice-looking family. You have 2 boys. Are they following you into EMS and amateur radio?
Don't know. My oldest is just 16 now, and my youngest has just turned 11. And I find it interesting that the amateur radio is something that I always drag along when we go camping, when we go canoeing. I always have a radio with me. And they will use it. I find the oldest, he'll very much tell his friends about it. You know, Dad was listening to a numbered station the other night. Do you want to hear a numbered station? And we go down to the radio room, and he'll get me to tune in a number station, and then we'll talk about it. And he's not much for talking on it, but he finds it very fascinating. Whereas my youngest, I think he might be a ham and may take the test at some point. Very, very interested in Morse code. Very, very interested in the gaming of POTA activations and the Parks on the Air type of activations. So he might be a future ham. As for being a paramedic, my oldest wants to be a firefighter, but not necessarily be a firefighter to fight fires. He wants to be a mechanic that works on fire trucks. So very, very niche perspective.
Oh, that sounds like a great niche too.
But who knows? They're young. They spend a lot of time down in this radio room that I'm trying to build. And I think amateur radio is one of those things that we talked about earlier. It's wide open, and what you can do with microprocessors and building radios and whisper link and sticking stuff on rockets and launching it up and measuring things via amateur radio, like it really is wide open what we can and can't do from an amateur radio perspective. How
important is making a difference to you?
I think I've spent my whole life making a difference, and I think it is really, really important. And I hope that if there's anything I can inspire into my children is that everything we do has an impact on the world around us. And we all, at the end of the day, we all have to get along. We all have to work together. But if we do work together, then it's a much better place. And I remember there's the book, and they made it into a movie, Into the Wild. And it was the gentleman that went up north, and he died at a bus, and for various reasons. But the story really speaks to, we love adventure, but humans do better when we do it together. And from my perspective, I think everything relates back to, Sean McCain did a great job going out and exploring the world, but if he had brought people, he would be alive and he would survive. And I think we as a society do better when we do it together and work together.
Was that a true story, Into the Wild?
Yeah.
It was a terrible movie. I saw it.
The book's better.
It was terrible from the standpoint that you knew he was going to get stranded.
Yeah.
He was in the most beautiful place, and he didn't think things through. So I encourage people, actually, they shouldn't take my word for it. They should see the movie, because I think for exactly the reason that you're saying is that there was no preparation and he did it by himself. We won't tell people how it ended. We know that he dies, but essentially he got surrounded by rivers he couldn't cross, right? That weren't there when he went into the wild to begin with.
He didn't have the strength to get out.
Right, exactly. You never think about this, and I didn't think about it either until I saw this movie. But because of this island that was created from these rivers, all of the game, all the wildlife actually knew better.
Not to be on the island.
Not to be on the island, right? Not only was he stuck, there was nothing to eat out there. Yeah, that was a very interesting movie. What excites you the most about amateur radio now that you finally have your license, you have your HF radio? What excites you the most about the hobby?
For me, I enjoy Parks on the Air. I enjoy the SOTA activation. I'd like to spend more time doing that. And for me, it's the opportunity that amateur radio presents. And I think back to my transition period of leaving EMS and going into my current role. And I do believe ham radio played that role into because it became, emergency management became out of ham radio and seeing what we were doing with ham radio and my role at working at dispatch and in the ambulance. It's all those building blocks that we lay down in life, and then we end up where we're at going, oh, how did we get here? Well, here's the foundation that got us here. And I think what excites me when you look at that foundation I'm building is there's so many opportunities and there's so many amazing clubs out there. And I wish more people got involved because I truly believe that we can do so much and we can do a lot of really, really cool things from building cool antennas and communicating off the moon or communicating to satellites or even just building your own satellite and getting it launched up. A university group here at Dalhousie University built their own satellite, put it on a rocket and launched it, and then used our radio equipment to try to connect to it. The skies are the limit. And I think from my perspective, I look at my youngest, he's going into a middle school, and this fall I'm going to be reaching out to their principal saying, is there some type of science program that we can set up for these kids where they can maybe learn a little bit of programming? Maybe we can get some Raspberry Pis. Maybe we can get some SDR radios, maybe even some CB radios, and see if we can kind of get their head around engineering and that whole communication piece and get them building stuff. And they don't need their ham license to do really, really cool things from listening. But you build that foundation. You get them hooked on, I want to build this cool antenna. So I can listen to these satellites. Well, now I actually want to communicate to the satellite. So I'll get my license so I can communicate to the satellite. And I think the old selling point of you can talk around the world to today's kids doesn't work. And my youngest and my oldest play video games. They talk to people around the world every day. It's not the same appeal. So we have to change the carrot. And I think the carrot needs to be, you can build it, you can design it. And a lot like surfing, you never know what you're going to catch when you get out there, and the waves keep changing.
Or what's going to catch you.
Or what's going to catch you, yeah.
Oh, very interesting. Do you have advice to newer returning hams that you'd give now that you're in the hobby and you're playing an emergency management role?
I think it's really easy to get stuck in your ways and really, really easy to, we've always done it this way, so we're always going to continue doing it this way. And I really think we need to start thinking out of the box. And a great example at our club, we're redesigning our radio room and putting energy into what does a radio room look like. And for me, I started thinking, well, we have all these radios, but why not a sofa? Why don't we put a sofa in our radio room and make it more like a clubhouse? We put so much energy into emergency management and that we lose sight of the fact that this should be fun and this hobby should be enjoyable. And if you can have all the radios, you can have all the antennas, you can have all the gear, but if you don't have people, then you have nothing. And people are really what make a disaster work. When I look back on Swiss Air and the team, over 100 hams showed up to do their work and to communicate and set things up. But if those 100 people weren't there, that operation would not have happened. And equipment does not solve the problem. People solve the problem. And I'd like to clubs and I'd like to see groups focus on their people, not on their equipment. And for me, I'm pushing forward, hey, this room that we have our radios in should be a place that we can hang out. I want to be able to sit here in a comfortable chair on the sofa and watch someone make a contact and just make it a very social experience. And I think if we can build on that experience piece and that club atmosphere and that unity, I think we'll have better, stronger clubs and more engagement and less rigid emergency management rigidity. Because in a disaster, everyone wants to help. There's no shortage of people that want to help, and there's no shortage of expertise. But having people that are passionate and educated comes from that club and atmosphere, that sense of unity, and just knowing people, knowing what people are good at and knowing what people are not good at, what their strengths and weaknesses are. But that comes from just spending time and having coffee with them.
Well, I think that's a great idea. I like the idea of also of a coffee machine or a soda machine. I personally, a lot of ham radio events, I actually like the social side of it more than I like the operating side. I like to watch people operate, but I also like to do the socialization. I think you said it very well. I just want to tell the listeners that the reason that we're having this conversation is that John sent me a message on the QSO Today contact form to tell me about himself and what he was doing up there in Nova Scotia. And it was so intriguing that I sent John an invitation to be my guest on the QSO Today podcast. So that's actually how it works. Some people think that I'm going after the A-team, but the fact is that the A-team exists in all kinds of places, including Nova Scotia. So I encourage people to always let me know if there are people or themselves that have interesting stories that they want to share with the QSO Today podcast. John, it was such a pleasure having you on the QSO Today podcast, hearing about your story and hearing about what's happening in Nova Scotia and how you're making a difference. I think that that's one of the things that we should always do in our lives is no matter how small we think that difference is, it does have a cataclysmic impact at some point.
True.
So with that, I want to thank you so much and wish you 73.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity to come here and talk about amateur radio. And September 2nd is the 25th anniversary of Swiss Air, and it had a huge impact on communications in Nova Scotia. And so many hams played a vital role in establishing good communications for that disaster. And if they weren't there, it probably wouldn't have gone as smooth as it did. So I appreciate you having me on the show. I appreciate all the hams that played an active role 25 years ago. And I wish everyone was 73.
That concludes this episode of QSO Today. I hope that you enjoyed this QSO with John. Please be sure to check out the show notes that include links and information about the topics that we discussed. Go to www.qsotoday.com and put in VE1JMB in the search box at the top of the page. Be sure to get your ticket for the QSO Today Academy event on September 9th and 10th, 2023. You can attend from any place in the world using our new Sequel.io platform. Tickets are $15. Just click on the link on this week's show notes page. You may notice that some of the episodes are transcribed into written text. If you'd like to sponsor this or any of the episodes into written text, please contact me. Support the QSO Today podcast by first joining the QSO Today email list by pressing on the subscribe buttons on the show notes page. I will not spam you or share your email address with anyone. Become a listener sponsor monthly or annually by clicking on the sponsor buttons on the show notes pages. Your value for value support is recognized on the QSO Today podcast and in the weekly show notes. Use our Amazon link when you shop on Amazon. Clicking on this link before you enter Amazon will allow Amazon to pay us a small commission on what you purchase. This is a very painless way to support the QSO Today podcast. QSO Today is syndicated on every podcast platform, including Spotify and the iTunes Store. Until next time, this is Eric for Z1UG 73. The QSO Today podcast is a product of KEG Media Inc., who is solely responsible for its content.